Hello, everyone. Happy Saturday and good morning to you all. Welcome to another author interview on Tales from the Wandering Scribe here on the channel. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. My guest today grew up in a small rural town in North Dakota where she passed the long winters devouring books of all genres and playing video games with her big brother. After a school project required creating her first story to share, she fell in love with how fiction is capable of touching the hearts and minds of others. Her passion for writing only grew stronger over the years, and she published her debut novel, The Drift, in March of 2021. She still lives in North Dakota with her amazing patient husband and two incredible daughters. When not reading or writing, chances are she's either spending time with family, baking, or boxing. Joining us on the channel for the very first time, let's give a warm welcome to author Casie Aufenthie. Casie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So before we dive into your book, The Drift, is there anything else you'd like to share about your background?
I was actually an English major in college, and they say, well, what are you going to do with an English lit degree? Apparently, become an indie author is what you do. So, if anyone's wondering, that's an option.
Awesome. And what can you tell us about your novel, The Drift? Because the cover you sent me an email, I mean, it gave me the old school 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s sci-fi. So what can you tell us about your book?
So, it is a dystopian sci fi set a few hundred years in the future where the human race is actually evolved. So, you're thinking kind of H.G. Wells' time machine vibes. Um,
Okay.
there are the mentally evolved Illuminados, so that's going to be your psychics, telekinetics, etc. And then there's your physically evolved corporate. And what the
Mm.
book is about is essentially I dub it as Romeo and who rule the world. My female character is one of the top of the physically elite, and they've kind of been subjugated after this evolutionary war. And when these two meet, it kind of changes the world, but maybe not for the better.
Oh no, that doesn't sound good. And if it's kind of like Romeo and Juliet, there's a lot of people that are going to die, I imagine.
um, I have had readers tell me that after about the last 25% of the book, they're needing a lot of tissues.
Oh, okay, that already answered that question. Oh God. Man, so Romeo and Juliet meets the X-Men. That's actually quite an interesting like tagline for it. So when creating the story of Drift, what is sort of the need or desire you are creating for your readers?
So when I was growing up, sci-fi was one of my absolute favorite genres. But I noticed that the women characters were very much kind of monotone and flat and were very often just the arm candy of the hero.
Mm-hmm.
So that always really bothered me. So one of the goals I had with my book was to make them true partners. I didn't want to take away his strength and his power, but I wanted them to be equals and I wanted them to have different strengths and abilities that complemented each other. And so that's what I created with my two main characters.
Nice, nice. And that is very true. And you're absolutely right. Especially like the old sci-fi, the female characters do tend to be the love interest, as you mentioned, the arm candy. But sometimes for good characters, they do have to complement each other. Like one character is probably weak in this area, so the other character complements that. It's almost like, as I remember, the Friends cycle, where all the characters from the show Friends, they all complement one another to fit in those strengths. So that's actually really, really cool. And you're welcome. What is sort of like the promise that you're making with the drift based upon this desire you want to satisfy for your readers?
I hope that people all find a character that they really relate to, which so far, based on feedback, has been the case. And I really want people to love these characters and feel with them and go on this emotional roller coaster with them.
Nice. And kind of like talking about feedback, What was the general consensus when you began writing, or even going a little bit further, when you actually finished the first draft and went into the beta reading, the ARC readings, and then publishing it? What was the general consensus? Was it positive? Was it negative, mixed, or something different?
I had really positive feedback actually, because I didn't know if I was going to publish it first because I was a little scared of, well, what if it's just totally terrible and everybody hates it? The
Right.
usual author fear. But everybody said it was just really unique. It starts off the same kind of dystopian tropes you're used to, but it takes a lot of really great spins. I've got a more mature outlook on the characters where if they miscommunicate, they fix it pretty fast. So kind of taking it in a new adult version of it, and got a lot of twists and turns and surprises that people weren't expecting and really like. And one comment that I still get a lot of is that they have never felt with the characters as acutely as when they have read my book. Like that's one thing that readers are always really surprised of, is there, I know exactly how this character feels and I felt it and I thought about it days afterward. And
Wow,
that's
that
like
is
gives me
quite a
goosebumps.
huge
I love that.
that's quite a huge compliment when the readers actually really connect with your characters. And would you say there's a standout review that you really hold true, like in the beginning when you first published this back in 2021?
I would say one of the first reviews I ever got was one that really the complexity of the characters and just the love they had for my characters was everything to me.
Awesome. That's actually great. And I think that's probably the best thing for any author, is when the reader connects with the characters and gets the message. And I think that's really, really incredible. And kind of leading into that question, would you feel that that kind of validates your promise that the readers really get the message that you're trying to tell in your story, and from your characters as well?
I think so. I mean, of course, there's always going to be people who don't like your story because everyone has different tastes. But by and large, I've had really positive feedback that has made me feel like I've done the right thing and I've made the right path and have really truly validated, like you said.
Nice. And now, kind of going back in time, where did sort of the idea of the drift come about? Did you want to write this story very early on in your life, or did this kind of come about later from an evolution of multiple stories coming together to make a new story?
I would say it's more of a conglomeration of ideas I've had forever. But the main inspiration, oddly enough, was an episode of the original Charm, of all things.
Oh, okay.
So there's an episode in about season 6 where it deals with the characters go to the future, and this good guy meets this assassin girl, and somehow they fall in love. And the show never really shows how that happened, and it always really bothered me. I'm like, how did these two very different people meet, and under what circumstance did they fall in love? And that is the basis of what started my journey with the drift. Is I wanted to answer that question of how would this really big idealist fall in love with someone who actually kills people.
Oh, dang. So would you say that kind of was your aha moment, that this is where you want to become a writer, try your hand at being an author? Or would you say that came about earlier in life when you had to create your own a short story in school?
I always wanted to be an author. After that, instance you were speaking of when I was a kid, I always wanted to be an author. I just couldn't find the right story or the right characters to overcome that, paralyzing fear of failure.
Right.
Um, but when I was a kid, we had to do a story. I think I was 6, maybe 7 years old, and it was around Christmas time, and we were going to a nursing home to read to the elderly.
Oh,
And
okay.
so I came up with this little Christmas story and I read it to them. And it was actually this group of elderly men. And they were just so loving of this story. And they were laughing in all the right spots and they were awing in all the right spots. And I was like, this is what I want to do forever.
Wow. You're probably the second guest I've had on my show for this month that I've actually decided to become an author from a school project. And I think that's really, really, really cool to see that evolution, that creativity flow. And now this kind of gets to a more heavy set question. So brace yourself. So I would imagine when you began writing The Drift after a series of other influences, other creative things that you probably have seen, may have read, that sort of finalize the idea. As I've always talked about on the show, writing is a very lonely process. Writing a book is lonely. You spend hours on it, and when you finally get it done, there's a good chance that it may not get the readership that it wants. It may be forgotten. It may sell a few copies, and that is kind of deflating for any indie author wanting to get their hands into this industry. So for you, Casie, have you ever had those bleak moments of sort of like, it's more than beyond writer's block, it's sort of like imposter syndrome, and then adding on to that, what has still disciplined you to continue writing because this is something that you're passionate about and you want to continue doing?
So I actually had about 10 years where I gave up. I let that really nasty little voice in the back of your head win that said you have no talent, you can't do this. Because I kept starting stories and I kept starting stories, and I get maybe 2 or 3 chapters in and I'm like, this is stupid. Nobody's going to want to read this. I have no talent. And so I gave up. Like, I legitimately gave up. And it felt like part of me was missing during that time for a really long time. I just didn't really feel whole. Well, fortunately, my husband ended up being a very special kind of person who, he found out I used to write all the time. He said, why don't you write anymore? And so I told him, and he's like, I think you need to try again. I've read your writing. You're talented. You can do this. And so I had him in my corner, and he kind of kept pushing and shoving and helping me fight that, doubt and fear. And I finished the copy of The Drift. And he was my beta reader, alpha reader, all the readers, because I didn't know what I was doing at that point. And he's very big into sci-fi and fantasy and political intrigue and all these things. And he's like, this is good.
Okay.
Have something. You need to publish this. And so he was completely in my corner. And as I'm going through the process, that little spark of what feeds your soul kind of relit. And I realized I couldn't stop. I couldn't not do this. And it ended up being part of the message that's in The Drift, as far as how important it is to have a dream and fight for it.
Nice. That's actually really, really powerful. It's always good to have people in your corner that really, really support you, that see your work, they see your talent, and they say that this is something that you have to do. And then kind of leading into that, so as you just mentioned that you took like a long break before you got back into writing. So what books would you say have helped you fine-tune and find your authorial voice? Because I think that's another aspect that a lot of people really don't consider for indie authors when it comes to like research. Is more than just writing and the style of writing, it's also the genre of writing. If it's like dystopian fantasy, dystopian science fiction, there's a specific tone or language that feels organic to that genre. And there are a lot of authors that specialize in those types of genres of writing. So for you, Casie, what authors would you say have really pushed you to be a better author for yourself?
Gosh, I probably have a mix of different authors that influence the way I write. My biggest influence was actually fantasy author Anne McCaffrey. Dragon Riders of Pern, the relationship between her main characters was what I wanted for my main characters. The main character in her book, Lessa, is one of my all-time favorite characters. She's very cunning. Like, she's not physically intimidating. She couldn't beat anybody up, but she's extremely cunning. And she uses that to help her partner, who is the leader, and things like that. And so their dynamic really helped inspire that connection in my characters. And then, oddly enough, and I cannot think of the name of the author right now, and I feel terrible, but the Born Identity series.
Oh, yes, yes. I know
love the
the series.
action, the way it's written in that book, and the different world aspect. This character's traveling all over the globe, all over Europe, all over. And one thing that always bothered me in dystopian writing is everybody's from the United States. Like
Yes.
something tragic happened to the world, but we're all just located in one spot and sound the same. And so that was something that I took to my book and decided I'm going to have people from everywhere. And so there are different dialects and accents and cultures and everything in the book. And then just random sci-fi that I've read throughout the years, different Star Wars novels, different, Dune, of course, is going to be super popular now because of the movie, but
Yes.
I liked it before there was a movie. Just the classics, H2O's Time Machine, and I mean, all of them, they all come together to kind of help formulate your voice and what you want for your characters in your story. So I don't know that it's any specific one, but lots of different pieces.
Nice. And I'm also gonna geek out here for a little bit. I'm glad you actually mentioned Star Wars novels. You're probably the first guest I've actually had on the show that have mentioned that. Yes, if viewers, if you don't know me, I'm a big Star Wars fan, so this is really, really cool for me, really huge for me to have a guest on here that loves Star Wars novels, because I definitely feel that people don't really like the Star Wars novels, like the Legend, because that is really, really good storytelling. It really expands the old lore. And what's also really nice is that it is Star Wars, but it doesn't feel like the Star Wars that we know, in the sense it's not just the Jedi and the Sith. You sometimes have Diary of the 501st, the Scourge of the Jedi, the Bounty Hunter trilogy or the series. There's a lot of other elements in those Star Wars books, those old ones by Del Rey, that really, really captivate readers of like thrillers, crime, mystery, fantasy, and so forth. So that's really, really cool. Sorry I had to geek out about that. I just love talking about Star Wars, but that'll be for another time. And now we kind of get into the business side of being an author. So for you, Casie, when you completed The Drift, you got it finalized, you got the cover, it's been edited, you've had your art creators, and you've had it read numerous times. Did you want to become an indie author solely early on, like, this is what I want to do? Or did you want to try your hand at the traditionally publishing route?
So by the time I really started writing and the drift was ready to go, I had a very young child. And so I was like, I don't have the ability to go based on someone else's timeline as far as when the next book's going to be done. I don't want that kind of pressure. I want to be able to do things at my own pace and in my own way. And so trad really didn't enter my head. I wasn't planning on using this as, my career. It was something that was purely passion, and I wanted it to stay purely passion so that it didn't get tainted.
Mm-hmm.
And so indie was the perfect fit for me.
Nice. And kind of now into the realm of being an indie author, what have you learned from being an indie author in terms of, like, you have to market your own book, you have to get your own cover artists, editors, and blasting it on social media, which is huge. And then tying it also to your second book, because I was able to look at your website, that you also have a sequel to it. So what have you learned from the drift in marketing and being an indie author that you now apply to your second book, the sequel?
I learned so much because I had no idea what I was doing with the drift, to be totally honest. I was like, I'm just going to throw this out here after it's been edited. And unfortunately, one thing to warn people who are thinking about going into this business, if you will, there are a lot of scammers. And I got
Yes.
taken in by one of them who, oh, yeah, we'll do your cover and your editing and all this other stuff. And I was like, great. And I thought, I'm going to put out the most professional product I can. Paid this company to do, they're supposed to do all 3 types of editing for you. Get my author copy of the book, and it is a mess. There are
Oh
typos, there are missing
no.
words. So I ended up, the first night it went live, because the company that did this pushed it out without giving me a proof.
Oh
Um,
no.
so the first night I get my author copy, you have that ecstatic moment of, you're like, I'm holding my dream in my hands, and I open it up and I find that first error, and I'm like, oh no, people are going to buy this. I literally stayed up all night red marking my own book and editing it myself and getting it out there. And then it's funny is now people are like, yeah, this is really well edited. I'm like, yeah, because I did it myself.
Oh my. Gosh, yeah, that is probably the scariest thing about being an indie author, which is you don't know what kind of presses those are. We're talking about vanity press,
Mm.
which is probably the biggest danger for the publishing industry. And I've talked about this with a lot of guests on the show before. If you don't know what vanity press is, it is a style of publishing where pretty much a company will promise to promote your book, do all the edits, but they'll take 90% of the royalties. You barely would get any at all, depending on the contract. And it will not be your own work. It'll be completely different. And the worst instance of this happening is that they will probably find a way to own your book. You'll no longer be yours, it will be theirs. I've had that happen to a good friend of mine where she had to fight to get the creative control. And if you know what I'm talking about, you know that it was a struggle. So I think that's definitely a lot of dangers for indie authors trying to figure out, what should I do? And that also is kind of deflating too, because it takes one bad instance to completely deter a person from writing. And it's very, very scary. But in those instances, there are moments to grow and to learn. And I think another thing to learn from being an indie author is also, as you said before, that you were not sure how to publish your first book at the time. You now have a better understanding. And would you say that probably the biggest thing that a lot of indie authors, beginning indie authors, don't take into consideration is their readers, their audience, in the sense of what is the audience, or who are the readers that are really going to like this book? If you're a dystopian fiction, dystopian fantasy, you really want to try to market to that audience. Then again, I've had some people who have said a broad audience is good, you can hit a bigger market. So, in your opinion, Casie, how important is it to really know your reader and understand your audience?
I think it's always going to be important to understand who you're writing for. But I also think it's important not to get too caught up in it,
Mm-hmm.
because if you're so busy trying to figure out what's going to sell, it's not going to really be your story anymore. You're maybe not going to be as passionate about it. I think certain beats might fall flat because you're trying to hit this marketability standard. So I think write the story that you want to tell, but then when you're marketing it, try to figure out who fits that story, not the other way around. So don't write for specifically a market, but write your story that you love and then figure out who really did you write this for. So for me, it's I wrote this for girls like me who, when growing up, didn't have these characters, didn't have, the complexity, the, global reach of everything. The things that I wanted as a reader, I put in my story, and now I'm finding readers who are the same. And that, has worked for me really well. Um, the other thing is to try to find the comps. That's going to be really important. And some of that came from reader feedback. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
really consider my book very Hunger Games like, but over and over again, this gave me Hunger Games vibes, or oh, this gave me Divergent vibes, or, those kind of titles start coming out in the reviews and go, oh, I didn't mean to do that, but makes sense now that they said it.
That's actually really true. And it actually kind of brings up an old question I used to ask my guests on the show before, which is, so in those instances, as you said, where people said, oh, this gave me Hunger Games vibes or gave me this vibes, a lot of authors I've talked about say that that is really nice to find the comparison, but they've also mentioned that they don't want to be like those authors who have written those books. So in your opinion, Casie, like, where do you find that balance where it's like, I'm glad that you saw the comparison, but I'm not trying to be the author of the Hunger Games, or I'm not trying to be George R. R. Martin or the author of Dune. I'm just trying to be my own author. Yes, they've influenced my writing in terms of like character, story structure, narrative, and so forth, but it's not like the next Dune, the next so and so. This is my story.
I think that as long as you're staying true to your story, you don't really have to worry about that too much. I mean, if you're not going out trying to be the next, writer of Dune and etc., I think you'll be okay. I take it more as a compliment than anything to be worried about, because it's like, oh, they saw this connection between this character and the character they loved over here, or they got the same feeling from my book that they got from this other book. That's more often what I get, is they
All
got the
right.
same feeling. Oh, the stakes were really high, just like over here. Oh, this male character was really sweet like PETA, or, that kind of thing.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so I think as long as you're not purposely setting yourself up with that expectation, I don't necessarily feel like readers are going to put that on you so much. It's just that they're pulling things that they've loved in other books and going, I finally found it again.
All right. That makes sense. That definitely does make sense. And kind of now a little fun tangent question. I'm talking about your sequel book. So after the success of The Drift, how did the sequel come about? Did you take a break from writing for a little bit, or because your mind was very, very in tune with the story that you were still thinking about it, that you wanted to continue writing? Because I had a guest on my show recently who said, if you still have the series in your head and you know how it's going to end, keep writing until you know it's going to end. Did that kind of happen to you, or did something different happen for the sequel in creating it?
I'd say it was a little bit of that. It was definitely, I have this story very ingrained. I know these characters really well. I know exactly where we're going. Um, Plus, the first book ended on kind of a sad note, you know, as it were. And I didn't want to leave readers hanging too long. So I also had a pressure to my readers that I needed to get them the rest of the story, or at least the next section, as quickly as I could. So I actually made a really big push for the second book. It came out the next year.
Okay.
So I really, really pushed myself hard on that one. There is going to be a third book, but life happened, and so it's taking a little bit longer to come out. I ended up having another child, and pregnancy brain is real, I've learned. Trying to write during that time did not go well. So I'm finishing it up now. Hopefully it'll be out this December.
Oh, nice. That's actually really, really cool. And this kind of goes back to a thing I've always talked with my authors, and a new thing I've learned uh, being on this show, which is for all indie authors who are just starting out in this industry, in this business. I think one of the biggest lies, and I'm going to reword this differently from how I usually have said it, is that your debut novel is going to make your name. It's going to be a start of your legacy. Now, I'm going to change it to where, in some cases, that is true, where your debut novel will be the start of your name. But in other cases, it may not be the start of your name. Like, people will not know you for this book. And that could be another deflating moment where, you have this imposter syndrome, you just put this book out there, but this does motivate you, or at least one would think it would motivate you to continue writing until you write that book. And it's like, now people know you as the author of this book, which may be your seventh book. And now you can tell them, hey, you like this book, you should see my other six to see my growth as an author. So for you, Casie, in your own opinion, how important is it for young authors to understand that concept, that there's a 50-50 chance that your debut novel is not going to be the book that gets your name out there on the digital stage?
I think it's incredibly important because, as you mentioned, you're putting blood, sweat, tears, years into this debut novel, and you see maybe on TikTok all these people who are exploding off their first book and they're quitting their day jobs and just going out to these conventions and things like that. And you're thinking, that's what's going to happen to me. That is lightning in a bottle. That is not
Yes.
how it normally happens. Normally, it is, like you said, that seventh book where now you have this backlist where you're maybe catching a lot of readers through different books, and then they're cycling through your series as they find you a little bit more. And also just, self-awareness. Your debut is maybe going to be your weakest book because
Mhm.
hopefully you're growing and you're getting stronger in your craft with each book, and you're learning from previous mistakes and reader feedback and things like that. And so, I guess my experience, people do love the first book, but I found that they prefer the second. They think that that one's better. They think it's more emotional. They think the writing's tighter. And I don't disagree because I feel like I did grow as an author. And so I can only imagine what it's going to be 6, 7 books down the road. So I do think it's important to have realistic expectations that this is a long game. It's not going to usually just be that one and you're famous or whatever you're hoping you're going to be, I guess.
Yeah, that is very true. And I'm actually glad you brought that up because social media is a huge platform for indie authors to promote their work. And yes, I've seen a lot of indie authors that have uh, promoted their work, have become successful, which congratulations to all those authors because that is a huge accomplishment, a huge achievement. That is a great milestone. But as we've just talked about, be realistic. Still continue to write on the side, but still have something that's going to have you be secure and stable. As one author said to me, don't quit your day job until you reach the point where you can actually live off your book royalties for the income. Then you can be a full time author. Until then, just still continue to write. And that kind of leads to like the last set of questions for the interview. Before we get to the final question, which is probably my all-time favorite. So for you, Casie, you've mentioned before that your husband is probably one of your biggest cheerleaders who really pushed you to continue writing and pursue your passion. Is there anyone else you would like to shout out who have really been huge cheerleaders, people that have motivated you, pushed you, disciplined you to continue writing because they know that this is where you belong?
I would say more so inspired me was my dad. Um, from a very young age, he would read me stories at night and he would change them. So, like, maybe he was telling me Cinderella and she was the villain, and he would make it really funny. And he would always do these little twists to make me laugh and change things. And it was the first time I realized, oh, you can take a story and make it your own. Like, I didn't know that was a thing. And then he was always introducing me to these classic sci-fi books, and some were pretty obscure that most people wouldn't even have heard of, and was just exposing me to all these great things that, at the time, I don't know that a lot of little girls were exposed to. Maybe they were. None of them that I knew, so I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it. um, but I mean, he just really instilled that love of books and that love of imagination and creativity and make believe and all those things. And when I actually published The Drift, he got this bottle of champagne and came over, and we celebrated. And it was just this really special moment because he's like, I knew you'd always get there. And yeah, that meant everything.
Wow. Your dad sounds like a pretty amazing guy. That is huge. I mean, I don't think I've ever had a guest tell me that one of their family members bought a bottle of champagne to celebrate such a momentous occasion. That is incredible, and I imagine that's probably like a very, very fond memory in your author's journey that's going to stick with you for the rest of your life.
Ever. Yeah. No, he bought like 10 copies to give to his friends and had me sign them that night. And we had, he and me and my mom, and my husband, we all had a little glass of champagne, and it was just this big deal. And I'm like, I'm probably not even going to sell a copy, right? And he's like, it doesn't matter. You did it. And that's always stuck with me.
That is very, very true. And I think, as you just point out, that's probably the biggest achievement any indie author can ever truly experience. Even if your book may not sell, even if it may not get to the New York Times bestselling list or USA bestselling list or sell millions of copies, you published a book. You published something that has been your passion, your baby for years. Who else can say that and put the time, the work, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the stress to create that? And that is a momentous occasion which should be celebrated and noted. Which kind of leads into the next question, which is, have you ever got a sense of validation from other indie authors who have come across your book from their readers who have mentioned saying, hey, you should check out this book from this author. It's a really, really good read. Because in any business, in any industry, it's one thing to join a new field and to show what you've learned. It's another thing entirely to be recognized by your peers in the same industry and get a sense of validation from them where it truly cements that this is where you belong?
Yeah, I would say I got very fortunate in the Twitter writer community where I had a few people find my book and read it and really love it that were also authors. And so they would recommend it to their readers and other people. Aaron Stobbs, Michelle Quirk, John St. Clair, Kat Kinney, you are all amazing human beings and I adore you. Um, Also read their books because they're fabulous. But their support was really what kind of got me a foothold and where I started finding more readers. And then what was also nice is they were able to offer advice. You know, they were more veteran than I was. And so when I was looking for a new cover artist, when I was looking for editing or ideas for something, I could reach out to any of them and they'd be like, yeah, absolutely, I can help you with that. I can answer that question. And so for me, one of the great joys is of finding those friends that are also indie authors and making those connections. And no one else quite understands the struggle like another indie author. So it's kind of a beautiful thing to have someone to turn to and be like, I just want to scream. I don't know what to do. Help. And they're like, gotcha. I know it. I understand you.
Definitely 100%. The Indie Author community has been very, very impactful for me and my own journey. And we all want to support each other's successes because now more than ever, the Indie Author community is exploding. Like a lot of the high profile authors that we probably see in Barnes and Noble, they are indie authors. Shout outs to uh, Rachel Wright, who I've had on the show, S.G. Blaze, who I've had on the show, and many other authors. They are indie authors as well, and they are blowing up the uh, publishing world, the indie author world, which is huge. And now this is probably the second to last question, and it's an old question I haven't asked a guest in a very, very long time. So, Casie, for you, looking back at your life, where you're at now, and seeing all the trials and tribulations that you've gone through, have you ever thought what your life might be like if you didn't continue writing? How different would your life be if you were here now talking to me?
I think I'd be sad. Um, I think I mentioned earlier where there was that long period where I didn't write and it felt like something was missing. It was like a half life. There was just something in my soul, if you will, that was unfulfilled and unfed and sad. It was sad. I tend to be of the mindset that everyone has a purpose and a place on this planet and worth and value and something that needs to be shared. um, and for me, I think it's my stories. I think it's the emotions they evoke in people, maybe the thoughts that I can possibly spring to mind in other people, make them see or look at something differently. And I feel like I have purpose when I write. And without it, it is that sort of almost shell like existence where you're not fully fulfilled, you're not fully here, you're not fully enjoying and experiencing every day.
That is really, really powerful. And this now leads to the final question of the interview, Casie. So, with all your experience that you have learned as an indie author yourself, what is your word of wisdom to other indie authors who are just joining this industry, who have a story that they want to write and they're unsure of how to go about it, and they want to transform from being a writer who's doing it as a hobby to potentially being a professional author, professional writer?
I would say the key is not only to do your research, but to also make those connections with other authors. Tap into the people who've been there before. The writing community is so unbelievably welcoming. If you have questions, you can put it out there, and people are more than happy to share their experiences and say, hey, this worked for me, this didn't work for me. You can try it this way, you can try it that way. And to have access to that wealth of information is invaluable, especially when you're like, I don't even know where to start. People will post questions about how to format books and they'll get 20 answers in an hour. They'll ask questions about who do you use for a cover artist? You'll get a bunch of answers from people. So if you can really find your group of writers that you know and trust, that is the most valuable asset you will ever find.
100% agree. Connections are very, very important in any industry. As one person said, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And the more you know about people, the greater chance you'll have in any industry. And with that, listeners, we will conclude this amazing author interview with our guest, Casie Aufenthie. Casie, thank you so much for joining us today. And where can people find and engage with you on social media? And where can people find The Drift and the sequel?
So I am on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and then The Drift and its sequel are both available on Amazon in all formats. The audiobook is also available on iTunes.
Ooh, nice. Very nice. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. And listeners, thank you for joining us today on this wonderful Saturday morning or evening or afternoon, wherever you are in the world listening to this or watching this. Again, I want to thank our guest, Casie, for joining us today and allowing us to hear her story as an author and her journey. And we wish her continued success going forward. Casie, thank you so much for being on the show. And just thank you for continue writing and continue being yourself in this industry.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And until next time, viewers and listeners, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below.